You expected awakening to feel like strength. That's what the word suggests. Awakening sounds like clarity, like finally seeing, like stepping out of confusion and into something solid, a more stable self, a more confident mind, a life that finally makes sense. But what many people experience after the moment of insight is not stability, it's fragility. You feel less certain, not more. You feel more exposed, not more grounded. You feel like you're losing your personality, like you can't hold a coherent version of yourself for long. You are not the same person in every room anymore, and instead of feeling free, you feel unstable. This channel doesn't teach, it reveals. And what it reveals here is uncomfortable. The instability you feel after awakening is not a sign that you failed. It is often a sign that something collapsed, not your mind, your persona. Carl Jung observed that the personality most people identify with is not the whole self. It is a social solution, a negotiated identity built for belonging, a mask that becomes so familiar you stop seeing it as a mask. You call it me, but much of it was built as an answer to a silent question. What version of me is allowed? That question shakes you long before you can articulate it. You are rewarded for certain expressions, corrected for others, praised for being easy, mature, reasonable, punished for being intense, inconvenient, complicated. So you learned to survive through presentation. You learned to become legible. And legibility is not truth. Legibility is adaptation. The persona is the adaptation that worked. It's the face that got you through school, family, relationships, work. The version of you that produced less conflict and more approval. The version that made life simpler for other people. And because it worked, you reinforced it. You didn't choose it once, you chose it thousands of times. Small self-edits, small silences, small agreements, small betrayals of instinct. Over time, the mask stops feeling like a mask. It becomes identity. So when awakening happens, when you start seeing the dynamics, the conditioning, the invisible games, your first assumption is that you're gaining something. But what often happens first is loss. You lose the ability to fully believe the persona. You can still perform it, but you can't feel it as real. And that is where fragility begins, because the persona was not only your social face, it was your structure. It told you how to behave, how to be liked, how to be safe. So when it cracks, you don't just feel more honest, you feel unprotected. This is why the period after awakening can feel like psychological vertigo. You speak and immediately hear yourself performing. You laugh and feel it isn't fully yours. You agree and feel a quiet disgust. You say no and feel immediate guilt. You start noticing that your identity was held together by automatic reflexes of adaptation, and when you interrupt those reflexes, the self becomes unstable. Not because the self is broken, because the self was never singular. Jung's view is disturbing in the simplest way. You are not one thing. The psyche is composed of parts, complexes, tendencies, contradictory drives. The persona is the part that negotiates with society, but it is not the total person. So when the persona weakens, you don't immediately become your true self. You meet multiplicity. You meet the parts you edited out. And that meeting is not always comforting, because those parts were excluded for a reason. Some were excluded because they were socially unacceptable. Some were excluded because they were dangerous in your environment. Some were excluded because they threatened attachment. And now, after awakening, those parts don't politely reintroduce themselves. They push. They show up as irritation, as sudden fatigue, as resentment that doesn't match the situation, as fantasies of escape, as a quiet rage when you're asked to be reasonable again. This is why your identity feels fragile. because you are no longer held together by one dominant mask. You are being reorganized, but reorganization feels like collapse. Most people are not prepared for this because the modern culture sells awakening as an upgrade, like a cleaner version of you will appear. But Jung would say the opposite. When consciousness expands, the unconscious responds. It compensates, it pushes back, it demands inclusion. So the moment you become more aware, you don't become simpler, you become more complex. And complexity feels like instability when your entire life was built around being consistent. The old version of you had a clear script. Be nice, be useful, be understandable, be good. That script created coherence. You could predict yourself. You could predict your reactions. You could predict how people would respond. And prediction is safety. Now that you're awake, you start refusing the script. Not aggressively, not as a dramatic rebellion. Sometimes it's only a small internal refusal. I don't want to do that anymore. But even that small refusal is enough to destabilize the persona, because the persona exists to maintain agreement. Agreement with others, agreement with expectations, agreement with the role you were assigned. So when you refuse, the persona loses purpose. And when something loses purpose, the psyche becomes uneasy. That unease is often felt as fragility. You don't know how to be in conversations without playing the old role. You don't know how to be loved without being useful. You don't know how to exist without performing coherence. So your identity feels like it's breaking. But what's breaking is not you. What's breaking is the contract, the unspoken contract that said, I will be this version of myself, and in return, I will be safe. Awakening reveals that contract, and once revealed, it's hard to keep honoring it without feeling false. This is why people after awakening often say something like, I don't recognize myself. They mean it as a complaint, but sometimes it's the first honest statement they've made in years, because the self they recognized was the persona. It was the mask they learned to trust. Now the mask feels thin, and when the mask feels thin, you suddenly notice how much of your identity depended on external feedback, approval, inclusion, being seen as good. So when you stop pursuing that feedback, you feel empty. Not because you have no self, because you have no mirror. The persona is a mirror-based identity. It is reinforced by the reactions of others. It is stable as long as the social environment confirms it. But when you awaken, you begin to outgrow the need for confirmation. And outgrowing confirmation feels like losing yourself, because you were never taught how to self-confirm. You were taught how to be confirmed. By being correct, by being calm, by being reasonable, by being harmless. So when you become less harmless, your old identity stops receiving the same reinforcement, and the psyche reacts. It tries to restore the old order. It offers guilt. Guilt is one of the strongest tools the persona uses to protect itself, because guilt pulls you back into compliance. You set a boundary and feel guilt. You stop explaining and feel guilt. You don't respond immediately and feel guilt. And the guilt feels like morality. It feels like you're being a bad person. But often, it's not morality. It's conditioning. It's the old persona defending its survival strategy. This is where awakening becomes psychologically confusing, because you feel two truths at once. One part of you knows the boundary is necessary. Another part of you feels like you've committed a crime. You feel like you are betraying someone, even when you're simply withdrawing from a role that was killing you. That's fragility, not weakness, a system in transition. Jung would say that when the persona weakens, the shadow becomes more visible. The shadow is not simply evil, it is the rejected self. The parts you disowned because they didn't fit the image you needed to survive. the part that wants to say no, the part that wants to be left alone, the part that is tired of being good, the part that is tired of being interpreted. When awakening happens, the shadow doesn't arrive as a polite insight. It arrives as tension. You become less patient, less willing to perform, less willing to smile on command. And then you panic, because you mistake the return of your shadow for regression. You think, I'm becoming worse. But what might actually be happening is that you're becoming whole. Wholeness is not comfortable.
Wholeness is not positive. Wholeness includes conflict. So the psyche becomes unstable as it tries to integrate what was excluded. That integration doesn't feel like progress, it feels like contradiction. You care about people and you want distance. You want intimacy and you can't tolerate performance. You want freedom and you miss structure. So you feel fragile. You feel like you don't know who you are. And that is the moment most people rush to rebuild a persona. They create a new identity, a new version of themselves that is awake, a persona of awareness. They become the person who sees patterns, who is above drama, who is beyond conditioning. And Jung would warn you, that is still a persona, because the psyche cannot tolerate being without a mask for long, so it creates another one. This is what makes post-awakening identity so unstable. You are not simply losing one mask, you are oscillating between masks. Old persona, no persona, new persona, collapse, reconstruction. And the oscillation feels like fragility because you are trying to find a stable position. But stability doesn't arrive immediately after awakening. Stability comes later, after something deeper has formed. After you stop building identity around being seen. After you stop treating coherence as proof of health. Because coherence can be a defense. Sometimes the most coherent people are coherent because they are rigid. They cannot tolerate contradiction, so they create a clean narrative and force themselves to live inside it. Awakening disrupts that. It introduces contradictions you can't ignore. So your identity becomes fluid, and fluidity feels like danger if your survival depended on being consistent. This is why, after awakening, you may feel socially clumsy. You used to know how to respond. You used to know how to play the role. Now you hesitate, not because you're weak, but because you are no longer willing to betray yourself automatically. That hesitation looks like fragility, but it's also a sign of truth returning. The problem is that truth doesn't immediately give you a new script. Truth removes scripts, so you are left in an in-between space, a liminal space, a space where your old identity is no longer believable, but your new identity hasn't stabilized. And liminal spaces are uncomfortable. They feel like nothing is happening, but something is happening. The psyche is reorganizing. Jung would say that the psyche is self-regulating. When the conscious attitude changes, the unconscious responds with compensations, dreams, symptoms, desires that force balance. So if you spent years being overly agreeable, you may now feel sudden anger. If you spent years suppressing your needs, you may now feel sudden selfishness. If you spent years being morally correct, you may now feel morally indifferent. And you may interpret these as signs you are becoming worse, but they might be signs you are becoming less one-sided. The persona is always one-sided. It selects a slice of you that fits the world's demand. Awakening expands the slice. It brings back what was disowned. So the self feels fragile because it is no longer narrow enough to be stable in a simple way. That is the cost of waking up.
And the environment doesn't help, because as your persona weakens, people around you react, not because they hate you, because they were oriented by your old identity. Your old self was predictable. Your old self was manageable. Your old self was easy to read. Now you were harder to read. You pause. You don't reassure. You don't smile automatically. You don't explain. And people interpret that as threat. So they pressure you back into legibility.
They ask what's wrong. They say you've changed. They call you cold. And if you are still dependent on being understood, you will rebuild the mask quickly. You will become coherent again. Not because coherence is true, because coherence restores safety. This is the hidden dynamic. Awakening destabilizes identity because your identity was a negotiation with other people. So when you stop negotiating, the old structure collapses, and collapse feels like fragility. But fragility is not the end. Fragility is the transition. The dangerous part is what you do with fragility. Most people treat fragility as evidence they should return to the old self. They say, I was better before. I was calmer before. I was nicer before. But nicer is not always healthier. Calmer is not always more real. Sometimes calm is dissociation. Sometimes kindness is fear. Sometimes being better is just being more conditioned. Jung would say that the goal is not to become a perfect persona. The goal is individuation. And individuation is not self-improvement, it is integration. Integration is slower than performance. Performance can be rebuilt in a weekend. Integration takes time, because integration requires tolerating inner contradiction without resolving it by becoming a mask again. It requires you to hold the tension between parts, the part that wants peace, the part that wants truth, the part that wants belonging, the part that wants freedom. And holding that tension feels fragile, because you cannot lean fully into any one part without feeling the cost. So you become a person who can tolerate complexity. But complexity looks like instability to a world addicted to clear identities. This is why the post-awakening phase is often lonely, not because you are meant to isolate, but because you are no longer willing to participate in the same scripts. You can still love people, but you can't perform yourself for them the way you used to, and that changes everything. The most disturbing part is that after awakening, you often realize you don't even know what you like, not because you're empty, because your preferences were edited. You liked what got approval. You wanted what looked respectable. You enjoyed what kept you included. Now, without the old mirror, you must rediscover your own valuation. And rediscovering valuation feels like fragility because it starts small. It starts as subtle attraction and subtle refusal, not as a big identity. So you may feel like you have nothing to hold on to, and that's true. You have no persona strong enough to stabilize you. But that is the point, because the persona was never meant to be your foundation. It was meant to be your interface. When you treat the interface as the self, you live shallowly and call it stability. When the interface breaks, you finally meet depth. Depth feels unstable at first, because depth has layers, and layers conflict. So if your identity feels fragile after awakening, it may be because you are no longer willing to live as a single acceptable version of yourself. You are no longer willing to be only the persona, and the psyche is forcing you to become larger, not happier, larger, more complex, more honest, more whole. The danger is that you might confuse fragility with failure and rush back into the mask. You might choose quick coherence over slow integration. You might rebuild an identity that is socially impressive and call it growth. But Jung would ask you to notice something else. When you feel fragile, what exactly is fragile? Is it yourself? Or is it the social mask that used to keep you safe? Because those are not the same thing. And if the mask is breaking, maybe you're not breaking. Maybe you're being released. Released into a phase where you can no longer pretend that your identity is a performance. So here's the question that remains after this video ends. If your identity feels fragile, unstable, hard to hold, is that because you're falling apart? Or because you are finally no longer willing to be only what the world can recognize? And if the mask is breaking, what exactly is trying to be born underneath it? Silence.